Hello everybody. Long time no see. I wanted to come on tonight and talk about something that is near and dear to my heart, and that is pelvic organ prolapse. A lot of patients see pelvic floor therapists for prolapse, but I think it is kind of a misunderstood diagnosis, and it often, I think, freaks people out more than it should because they don't truly understand what's happening. So, why this is near and dear to me is I had issues with this after my second delivery. I pushed my son out in like 2 pushes, and I knew he wasn't low enough yet, but he needed to come out, so I gave it my all and kind of felt everything mush down when that happened. So my first couple weeks at home postpartum, I didn't really notice it because I wasn't very active. You know, you sit a lot, I was breastfeeding, and hadn't gotten back to much exercise yet. And at 8 weeks postpartum, I tried doing a HIIT video, like HIIT workout, and I was doing jumping jacks, and I remember just feeling something fall to the base of my vagina. It was an awful feeling, and I stopped and like cupped down there and tried to push it back up, but that was really like the start of my prolapse journey. So I tend to be a very lax individual. I have really loose joints, I have really flexible tissues, and I think this prolapse was just waiting for me to do something that was too high impact, and it took a couple jumping jacks and there it was. So I probably spent the next 15 months rehabbing my prolapse. I had really all 3 organs had prolapsed. My bladder was the worst, uterus was next, and then the rectum was after that. So I did a lot of reading, tried a lot of weird things. I went to Minnesota to do a class to really help treat prolapse, because in my pelvic health world at the time, I didn't have many methods for treating it besides Kegels, and for me, Kegels at the time were causing pain. So anyway, 15 months later, I learned how to manage the pressure in my pelvis. I strengthened my pelvis a lot. I learned the importance of flexibility of my pelvic floor, strengthened my hips, and strengthened my core, and kind of learned how that played into the feelings of prolapse and making it feel better. So what I wanted to do tonight is kind of explain what each different type of prolapse is, what it might feel like, and what some symptoms might be of that type of prolapse, and then some things that you can do to help prevent it from worsening and maybe help make it better, always with the end goal of you need to see a pelvic floor therapist. You know, these are like things to get you started, and maybe some tips to help you figure out what's going on down there, but always see a pelvic floor therapist. Okay, so what's prolapse? Basically, pelvic organ prolapse is when either your bladder, uterus, or rectum kind of falls to a lower position than what's normal. Often, childbirth causes this, so you know, a lot of pushing can stretch out the tissues that hold up those organs and cause them to get lower. Also straining, excessive straining, like on the toilet with bowel movements. If you have chronic constipation, you can get organ prolapse from that. So I've had a handful of patients who had never had kids before and have just spent a lot of time on the toilet and a lot of time pushing and actually caused organ prolapse. One of them even had to have a repair at like the age of 22 or 23 for a rectal prolapse. So straining is something that definitely causes this. Heavy lifting with improper lifting mechanics can cause it. So if you do something like CrossFit or like Olympic style weightlifting and you're using like a bracing technique, and we call it a Valsalva, but basically where you hold your breath and kind of bear down when you're weightlifting, that can definitely contribute. I've had patients that develop organ prolapse because of their sport and using those improper lifting techniques. For women, we kind of have to lift different than men in order to prevent these things from happening. So a lot of people come to me and they're like, something is falling out of my vagina. I think it's my bladder. You know, everything just feels like it's sagging down there. And in their minds, they think that their actual bladder or actual rectum is falling out through their vagina, when it's really pushing through the vaginal wall. So I usually use my hand as a model. It's a pretty handy dandy model. So if this is my vagina, or my vaginal canal, on top of the vaginal canal, if I was laying flat on my back and you were like staring into it, on top of the top wall of the vaginal canal supports my bladder. Okay, then you have the vaginal canal, and the uterus is up here, suspended at the end of the vaginal canal. And then underneath the vaginal canal is the rectum. So this bottom, I should hold it like this bottom wall of the vagina kind of helps give the rectum like a backstop when it's firm and like you haven't messed yourself up yet. So what bladder prolapse is after excessive straining or lifting, using Valsalva, whatever, that pressure causes this wall to stretch downward. And over time, or with a childbirth, it weakens this wall. And this wall can get overstretched or just lax from all the straining. So a bladder prolapse is when the bladder pushes into the vaginal wall, and like if you were looking in the vagina, it creates kind of a saggy bulge on the top wall of the vagina. So your bladder is pushing through the vaginal wall, creating a sensation of heaviness in the vagina from that pressure. Okay? A uterine prolapse is when the uterus pushes down or falls down, and is in a lower position closer to the opening of the vagina than it should be. It should be suspended up deep in the vagina. It does move into different positions throughout your cycle, your menstrual cycle. So like mid-cycle and a couple days before your period, it will be much closer to the opening. And you may notice this a lot more after you have kids because it has just more movement after you've had kids, if you've had vaginal deliveries. A rectal prolapse, just like the bladder prolapse, is when you've stretched this back wall. A lot of times people will tear through this back wall with vaginal deliveries, and that can also weaken this tissue. But anyway, it's when this back wall becomes weak or lax, and the rectum then pushes up into the bottom wall of the vagina. So if you were looking into the vagina, you might see a bulge if the rectum were full on the bottom part or the back side of the vagina. So symptoms of bladder prolapse may be incomplete emptying. So you might feel like, you go to the bathroom and you stand up and you feel like maybe some dribbles out, or you didn't fully empty even though you sat there the whole time. Some people feel like they have to rock back and forth on the toilet, which is actually a good technique to use if you do have bladder prolapse, because it kind of tips the bladder forward to make it in the position where it used to sit. The reason people feel like they don't empty their bladder completely is because the bladder has basically fallen backwards towards the vagina. It normally sits in front of the vagina. So if the wall that normally supports it and keeps it there has weakened, it tips back. So if this is my urethra and this is my bladder is sitting, this is excessive, but it's sitting like this. So I basically have a kink in the hose. So if you lean forward on the toilet, kind of tilting your pelvis to stick your butt out, sometimes that will tip the bladder back up to where it's a straight line from the bladder to the urethra so that you can empty more completely. bladder prolapses are most common of all of the types of prolapse, and most women have some degree of prolapse if they've had a vaginal birth. So I would say those are probably the most common symptoms of bladder prolapse. Uterine prolapse will often feel I describe it like a tongue sticking out of like the clam shell. So you know when you get a clam out of the lake and sometimes you can pry it open and the little body of the clam like does that. That's kind of what a uterine prolapse feels like. For me, I notice it like mid-cycle and then right before my period. And I can affect it positively by doing things to help improve its position, but those just tend to be times of the month where I notice it more. Rectal prolapse will often feel like if you need to have a bowel movement, you might feel it in the vagina. It might feel like heaviness or like a bulge in the vagina, and that's because that stool will often pocket in the vaginal space where it's lax, and so you might feel a bulge on like the back side of your vagina. A lot of people will say they don't feel like they can empty completely or they have to strain really hard, and often that's because the rectum should be a straight line, a straight tube. If this has gotten soft and that stool can pocket in there, now you're trying to push that stool that has pocketed up into the vagina, you're trying to push that through that kink and get it back down, to the distal or the lower end of the rectum. Some people find themselves doing what we call splinting. So this is actually an effective method to help empty your bowels if you have a rectal prolapse. But sitting on the toilet, they might put like 2 fingers up in that vaginal canal and push backwards, or they may put pressure on the perineum, like the space between the vagina and the rectum. They might put pressure up on that to help them fully empty. So anyway, those are all kind of symptoms of each type of prolapse. The biggest thing with treating prolapse is see a therapist, find a pelvic floor therapist. Or if you don't have one in your area, you can also find a urogynecologist. They often have methods to help treat this as well. From a physical therapy standpoint, we do a lot of education about, with bladder prolapse, timed voiding. So make sure you're going to the bathroom at regular intervals, like 2 to 3 hours, and I wouldn't hold it longer than that. If you let that bladder get really full, you're stretching it out and you're letting it tip back and back and back. With a bladder prolapse, you can often fill the bladder pretty full before you feel the urge to go. But that's dangerous because you're stretching out that wall that it falls into even more. So I notice if I go out for drinks with friends and, if I keep there and I sit there and I keep talking and I feel like I have to go, but I'm just going to hold it because I am having fun. And then I finally go and I pee for like 2 minutes. The next couple of days, I definitely notice that feeling of prolapse a lot more. So emptying your bladder at regular intervals can be really helpful. Then for uterine and any type of prolapse, you want to avoid straining. So all the time you're managing the pressure in your pelvis. So you really want to manage and prevent any type of bearing down. So if you pay attention to it, how often you hold your breath and bear down, it is way more than you think. I buy groceries at Aldi and I have huge grocery bags. If I pick them up out of my car, if I'm not careful, I will naturally hold my breath and kind of bear down on my pelvic floor as I'm loading these big bags of groceries onto my arm. Over time, that's pressure, and that can lower that position of the pelvic floor. Anytime you're going to lift something heavy, cough, sneeze, or laugh, think about it. Those are all activities that bear down on the pelvic floor. So a cough would be a lift, a sneeze, same thing. So you're always going to exhale when you go pick something up. Let that pressure out. You're going to tighten the lower abdominals and kegel the pelvic floor. So I'm closing the vaginal canal to stiffen up the walls that help support those prolapses, and then I'm exhaling my air as I lift to empty my pelvic cavity so that I don't have added pressure worsening those prolapses. With bowel movements, So with rectoceles, you always want to keep your bowels soft. They should look like a smooth, long snake, and we really want you to have one almost every day. You want to avoid straining. So if you're pushing out little rabbit turds and you're straining on the toilet every day, you're going to make that prolapse worse on a daily basis. So, you need to have enough water in your system, enough fiber, and then if that's not enough, talk to a specialist, therapist, your doctor, whatever, about starting something, maybe a stool softener or Miralax, or adding, psyllium husk or flaxseed or something to your diet. But you want those stools to be snake-like, easy to pass, no straining. You might try a squatty potty to get your body in a better position to evacuate stool, but spending too much time on the toilet and straining are not good things for organ prolapse. I usually tell people if you're on the toilet, for more than like 3 minutes, that's too much. So if you can't have a bowel movement within 3 minutes, it's probably time to get up. Okay. All right. So yeah, I think those are the biggest things I wanted to point out with organ prolapse. I'm going to post some videos of positions that you can get in to relieve some of the pressure from prolapse. Kegels are very helpful in thickening the walls and stiffening the walls that help support the prolapse. But if you do them too soon on your journey with prolapse, you may end up with stiff and tight pelvic floor muscles that are not very functional, meaning they're not going to work in preventing incontinence, and they may actually make your prolapse feel worse. So if they're really tight and not flexible, doing Kegels would be the wrong move in the beginning. You need to see a pelvic floor therapist to really assess your pelvic floor from the get-go. You want to make sure your pelvic floor is relaxed at rest and that it's not clenched at rest. If it's clenched at rest, you're not going to do Kegels until you learn how to calm the pelvic floor down, get to a normal resting state, and then you practice Kegels. And after every Kegel, you need to come back to that normal resting state so that you don't get stuck up tight, because that can make the symptoms of prolapse feel a lot worse, and it can be a lot harder to evacuate your stool. So I will post some pressure relieving positions for prolapse, and there's so much education to give on prolapse. I could talk about it for a long time, but I've been going for 17 minutes, and you're probably lost and bored at this point. But I'm really passionate about it. I love talking about prolapse and teaching about prolapse and teaching people symptoms to help manage their prolapse. Strategies to help manage their prolapse. So feel free to post any questions underneath this video, and I would love to answer them, or reach out to me privately. I get that prolapse is kind of a personal journey. So hope you're all having a good quarantine, and hopefully it's over soon.